The story begins in a place called the 9,000 Circles of Hell. There are 9,000 levels in total, and the weakest demons are on level 1, and the most powerful beings in the history of the universe live on the very last level. It is here that the continuous struggle for the title of the strongest has been going on for a long time. A huge, enraged yellow demon with a chain around his neck rushed towards one of the small islands. The small red demon immediately flew away from the place where it stood, dodging the yellow demon's attack, which immediately destroyed the place he was standing on. He quickly swung at the unsuspecting demon who couldn't see him in the dust, and hit him right in the face, confusing him. At the same moment, without wasting time on swinging for the next blow, and this blow with great force threw the yellow demon aside. He flew past many stone islands, turning them into small stones and dust along the way. The red demon hovered in the air and looked at the formed curtain of dust mixed with dirt and stones. From this curtain, the horn of the yellow demon first appeared, saying that he was a complete disappointment. Then he himself began to gradually emerge from the dusty veil, saying that he was expecting something great from the 9,000th level, about which there were so many rumors. Frame stepped forward arrogantly and finished his speech by saying that despite everything he had heard about him, his blows were just tickles. Puck, who was floating in the air and to whom Carcass was addressing himself, looked at him sternly, thoughtfully saying that he could only scratch with his tongue. This enraged Carcass, and with a furious cry about which of them was still scratching its tongue, rushed towards Puck, simultaneously raising its hand to strike. The small explosion that resulted from their clash slowly grew, becoming stronger and covering larger and larger areas. The frame flew out of it back at a tremendous speed, and Peak flew out after it at the same speed, immediately swinging for a strike. The blow landed squarely in Frame's unprotected stomach, knocking the wind out of him. From the force of this blow, under Puck's watchful gaze, he flew far forward, thereby destroying all the oncoming islands that he crashed into. With a confident smile, he clasped his hands and rushed after him. Swinging with all his might, he delivered a stunning blow straight to the Carcass's chin, not giving it time to recover. He struck the next blow at the stone island, leaving a huge hole at the site of the blow. Raising his head, he looked at the frame that had flown off in the other direction and swung again, and he rushed towards it, leaving a small explosion in an even bigger hole where the small explosion had been. Rama, having lost consciousness, fell head down without strength. Pak was not going to leave him in such a state, and again raised his hand to strike, which was gaining strength very quickly while it was still flying towards the frame. From this impact, they both quickly fell onto one of the islands, thereby creating a huge explosion at the point of impact. But when he saw the fall, there was only Pak in the clouds of dust, his hand still clenched into a fist. Hearing some sounds, he raised his head and looked around, seeing goblins approaching from all sides, making terrible sounds. Suddenly, one of them rushed straight into his face with a terrible sound. He swung his arm and, shouting furiously that it was a cheap trick, knocked back the goblins who had come too close to him with one blow. Feeling that he could not move, he turned around with a stern expression on his face. On one side, one goblin held him by the wing and two goblins held him by the arm and leg. On the other hand, his leg was held by two goblins, and his arm and wing were held by one each. Ram appeared behind him with a loud roar and immediately raised his hand to strike. Unable to turn completely, Puck, held by the goblins, turned his head towards him. The frame dealt a crushing blow to the place where he stood, intending to finish him off with one blow. From the force of this blow, the ground around him began to crack, and large stones crumbled into small fragments. With a confident smile, he peered into the dusty curtain in front of him, already anticipating an easy victory. However, in the place where Puck had stood before, there was no one and nothing except the trace of his blow in the lava. He raised his head and looked forward in shock. Puck seemed even more angry than before, and now his hands were burning. He waved his hand, gloomily saying that the jokes were over, and without further ado, he rushed towards the frame, thereby creating a huge blast wave in the place where he stood. The frame met the rapidly approaching Palak with a counterattack. He shouted loudly at Paku to die and struck, but to his surprise, there was no one at the site of the impact. Peak seemed to have disappeared, but then a yellow demon suddenly appeared behind him. Waving his hand full of fiery power, he said that the strongest in the 9,000 circles of hell is he, and it pierced Frame's body through and through, leaving a huge hole in it. Having flown through this hole, and continuing to move for some time by inertia after the impact, and then he stopped and stood on the ground. Frame's body fell heavily to the ground, but Palak didn't even turn around, lost in his thoughts. He thought that in these eternal battles there would eventually be no final winner until he appeared. Pak was shaking with fear, his eyes lowered to the floor. He, who had once said that no one but he could control the 9,000 circles of hell, now knelt down in horror, not daring to utter a word. This was the Demon King's castle, and all the demons bowed before the throne of the great ruler and king of hell, under whose control hell, previously split, had become a single whole. Pak, without raising his head, muttered a question about why he wanted to go back if he already had everything that hell had. There was no answer to his question, so there was silence. The boy's closed eyes opened slightly, and he looked at the demon in front of him, and then an even more terrifying energy began to emanate from him, which made Palak tremble even more. It was the power of the Devourer, which he knew firsthand. He absorbed all the demons he touched, destroying the 7 supreme demons, each of whom was so powerful that they could not defeat the others. It was he who stood above all demons, and this was his strongest ability as the king of hell. Those who had knelt before him, and the many thousands of demons who sat in a row, trembling from the powers emanating from the youth, began to tremble even more, realizing that he was angry. Even Puck, who knew no fear, could not help but shudder in horror. The king's voice was heard asking if he really owned everything in the world. He raised his hand, causing Puck to flinch again, and continued, saying that he had been stuck in this damn place for 10,000 years. Wasteland, bloody skies, and unquenchable flames. There is nothing else in the 9,000 circles of hell. The unchanging landscape and constant slaughter. The guy sitting on the throne took off the helmet he had on his head. His face twisted, and he asked irritably if there was anything else he could learn. Pak, with a flash of his eyes, assumed that he must be hungry and said that he had prepared a special dish for him, immediately barking at the demons standing nearby, saying that no matter what they threw at them, they would obey. The demons, following the order, brought in a huge plate covered with a lid. Puck, pointing to it, said that it was a modest gift from them to the king, expressing their devotion, so they hoped that he would not refuse. He grabbed the handle of the lid and opened it, saying that this was the head of Purr, the last of the line of supreme demons. On the plate, covered in dark, almost blue blood, lay the head of a demon. The sight presented to Kong Wu looked disgusting. Pak wished him a pleasant appetite. The guy's face twisted and he angrily threw the plate head-on at Puck, calling them stupid and saying that this wasn't what he wanted. He quickly apologized. Looking at the demon's head lying on the floor, he said that he did not want to eat this disgusting-looking and tasteless food. Biting his lip and clenching his hands into fists, the young man stepped forward. The demons began to tremble again from the energy emanating from the boy as he tried to say something. He was so angry that his voice began to break. Suddenly he said he wanted kimchi jjigae. Hearing him, the demons began to whisper about it and repeat his words, not daring to raise their heads. Their quiet voices gradually became louder and louder, repeating over and over again that kimchi jjigae is the food the king wants. The demons took his words literally and shouted that he wanted food filled with blood and meat, to which Kong Wu angrily called them idiots and said that was not it. Pak looked at Kong Wu with eyes full of devotion, asking from whose head this should be done. He said that he only needed to say it, and he would prepare everything, no matter how difficult it was. The other demons supported him, and Kong Wu, covering his eyes with his hands, said in a pitiful voice that this was completely different. For demons, food was nothing more than the devouring of the vanquished by the victor. Peak remembered that he also said something about him lacking entertainment, and he said regretfully that it was true because he killed all the strongest demons. The other demons confirmed this while trembling in fear, and Kong Wu shouted that he just wanted to read a manga or a novel. The irritated palace hit the ground with his fist as hard as he could, and lowering his head, said that he was so weak that he could not please him. Bursting with tears and snot, he screamed loudly, demanding that he be killed, and Kong Wu screamed in despair for him to at least listen to him. However, he did not stop crying, ordering Kong Wu to kill him. At least that's what he started with. He returned to his throne, thoughtfully saying that if only he had someone to love. One of the lined-up demons stepped forward and asked if there was enough of her. The succubus queen Lilith approached Kang Wu's throne. As she passed by the crowd of demons who admired her beauty, she placed her hand on her chest and turned to face the Demon King. Biting her lip in irritation, she asked if Lila's heart wasn't enough for him. She didn't look like he imagined, after all. A succubus who feeds on the sexual energy of other people should at least be beautiful. Her one face with 18 eyes covered everything. She was called an incredible beauty, but the sight of such beauty gave Kong Wu a headache, and he seemed to freeze in place. Meanwhile, Lilith continued dreamily saying that she would definitely come to his bedroom tonight. Kong-woo said in horror that as a king he ordered her not to come at all, to which she mockingly replied that he was very shy. She grabbed his hand with her slippery tentacles, trembling with disgust, and asked how he could even call himself the Lord of Hell after that. Kunwoo made a pained face and screamed as he tried to get out of the test tube trap. The demons watching them spoke with admiration about how they envied him and how lucky he was. She continued to crawl towards him, trying to kiss him, and he tried his best to push her away. Peek in turn did not know what to do, so he only watched in shock. He turned away from her and covered his face with his hands, begging her to disappear, although he believed that one shouldn't judge by looks and all that, but compared to her, even Peek looked cute. Kung-woo lowered his head and covered his face with his hands, looking forward in horror. He was not the type to look only at appearances and love, and this was not a problem. She did not meet human aesthetic standards in any way. Raising his hand, clenched into a fist, he called for everyone in the room to be silent. And, having waited until everyone had calmed down, he decisively declared that he was returning to Earth. Hearing his words, Puck and Lilith became frightened and turned to the Demon King sitting on the throne in fear, hoping to convince him. Despite the desperate attempts of the servants to persuade him to stay, his decision was unwavering. On the contrary, their convictions gave him confidence. He spent 10,000 years in hell, absorbing the last powerful demon Bala completed his preparations. He rose from his throne, thinking that now was the time, and he headed towards the exit, passing Puck and Lilith with the thought that it was finally time to get compensation for 10,000 years of torment. He turned around, looked at Puck and told him to get ready for this. Palak, understanding the Lord's steadfastness, humbly lowered his head, but still tried to say something. Kung-woo first calmly called him by name, and then with a terrifying aura he asked darkly if he really needed to be told twice. Peek fell to his knees in fear, and lowering his head apologized and said that they would now prepare everything. And under the indifferent gaze he turned to the demons, ordering them to summon and prepare the weapons of the great demons. The kneeling demons immediately obeyed his command. One of the demons, covered with a cloak, was reading some kind of spell on the stone statues of the defeated demons. The elevated area among the huge statues began to glow with white light. Pak pointed to the place and said that the preparations were complete, to which Kang-wo only replied that everything was fine and slowly moved in that direction. Lilith watched Kong walk away with her eyes full of tears. Pak bowed his head in dejection because the will of God was unshakable. Tears flowed from all 18 of Lilith's eyes, and even Pak began to cry after Kong-wo threw off his armor. And without turning around, he headed up the stairs. Suddenly, a magician turned to him and said that if he put all his energy into these 7 types of weapons, then they will be able to open a portal through time and space for a while. After listening to him, Kung-woo confidently said that this was great, and moving on, told him to begin. Kung-woo sighed softly, thinking about returning. The incomprehensible energy from Kung-woo's body began to be released, the power of a devourer growing over tens, hundreds, thousands of years. It is no exaggeration to say that even the 9,000th circle itself had already been absorbed by the king. That power was so great. Manmajong is a word that describes the part inside Kanyu that contains a clot of great power, which shattered into tiny pieces, releasing the enormous power hidden within it, who immediately soared into the sky under the watchful gaze of thousands of demons. All this energy was released from the body of the guy, who stood with his back to the demons and seemed not to notice that behind his back, the magician was covering his eyes with his hands from the blinding light. And he said in admiration that this is indeed Manmajong, the ultimate dark energy. They just need to look at this beauty to understand everything. The stone statues standing in a circle were gradually illuminated by light, and one of them had a white light glowing where its eyes should have been. Gradually, the eyes of the other statues began to glow with the same light, and the place in the middle of the statues standing in a circle began to shine with an even brighter and more dazzling light. The magician, looking at this with surprise, shouted loudly for all 7 weapons to respond, which caused the gates to open, but the guy didn't listen to him, looking at the opening gates and thinking about his return. He took the cloak off his shoulders. No family, no love, not even friends were waiting for him there. But even so, it was better than being there. Instantly, a split formed in space, and a black passage appeared before his eyes, into which he immediately headed, saying that he was leaving. Lilith, who had been silently watching the guy leave, called out to him. He stopped in surprise when he heard the sound of crying. Peak bowed his head in dejection, for the will of the Lord was unshakable, and tears flowed from all 18 of Lilith's eyes. She asked if he was really going to leave her. The guy didn't answer, and turning away only told her not to cry. Thinking to himself that she looked scary, he moved on. She probably misunderstood these words. Her tentacles trembled slightly, and under Puck's surprised gaze, she looked at him with love. And putting her hands to her heart, she said that these were very tender words, and it seemed to her that her heart was breaking from his love. And when she said this, one of the tentacles located near the heart actually burst, and pus gushed out of it right under the gaze of Kong Wo, who turned around at the wrong time. He looked with horror and disgust at Lilith, who said that she also wanted to go with the king. Looking at the approaching Lilith, Kong Wo quickly and without the slightest hesitation rushed into the opened portal. She ran after him, screaming that no matter what happened, Lilith would follow him. As he moved away from the pit, the scream gradually died down, and an unusual feeling came over his mind. He smiled and turned in that direction, giving Lilith the middle finger, with thoughts of never crossing their paths again. Kunwu thought that he had been in hell for 10,000 years. He had nothing to change in the past, and he had no hope for a bright future. He gradually approached the core, thinking only about the fact that the main thing for him was to reach that earth, the memory of which was deeply imprinted in his memory. Kung Wu fell to his feet next to the core, and with a joyful smile he said that now he would finally return to Earth. But suddenly he was attracted by the strange sounds that the core began to make, who initially reported a kernel access error, and then he started covering the entire space with a red laser. Don't forget to report that the defense system is now activated. Kun Wu, finding himself completely trapped in this dome, asked in surprise why this was happening and what was going on. A huge number of red signs immediately appeared before his eyes, warning him that he was dangerous because his power was too great. And then another notification appeared that all defense mechanisms were activated and the system was in reboot mode. At the same time, the guy heard some strange sounds. This completely unnatural voice coming from everywhere made Kang wince. The red dome began to emit some unknown energy, who immediately struck Kung Wu with great force. He screamed from the unexpected pain that pierced his entire body. The colonel reported an error, that the defect could not be corrected, and the restriction began. The boy gritted his teeth from the pain this energy caused, and he tried to clench his trembling hand into a fist, beginning to say that this was appropriate. But his thoughts were not destined to come together. His consciousness, like everything around him, became clouded. His body was pierced by such intense pain that he could barely move his fingers. Gathering his strength, Kung Wu, squinting in pain, opened his eyes. He looked around, wondering where he was. The sun's rays and the thick foliage of the trees indicated that he might be on Earth. Kung Wu took a deep breath and forced himself to sit up, wincing again at the sharp pain that spread throughout his body, thinking that first of all, he needed to check his condition. Suddenly, a sign appeared in front of his eyes indicating that the status information was being loaded. Just as he thought about checking his body, a blue panel appeared in front of his eyes. Surprised, he turned to the status window, which displayed full information about him, his condition, and abilities. His status board looked exactly the same as before he went to hell. Kung Wu's face twisted. He couldn't understand why this was happening and why his power was sealed. Suddenly, terrifying sounds were heard from behind him. Turning around and realizing where the sounds were coming from, the guy tensed up. They were small green goblins, short, chest-high young men with light green skin and sharp teeth. Without wasting any time, a crowd of hideous-looking monsters rushed towards him screaming. But as far as Kung Wu knew, such creatures had never been seen on Earth. Kung Wu gathered energy in his hand, thinking that he would have to deal with these guys first. But he was surprised to notice that the dark energy in his hand was weak. At the moment of battle with wildly screaming and attacking monsters from all sides, he had no time to think, which caused him to clench his hand into a fist, thinking that he had used something else then. A moment later, the monsters, struck by Kong Wo's black dagger, fell to the ground. This was the ability of the demonic blades of Sabin. Kung Wu's gaze was as calm as ever. He looked at the monsters. Anger began to rise inside the young man, similar to the aggression of predators. One of the goblins raised his hand to strike with a terrible cry. However, Kung Wu was immediately killed by a swift strike. The system quickly notified that El Goblin had been successfully killed, and then that the experience points were increased and he reached level 4, having finished off the monsters that attacked him. or rather the goblins, he again thought about what kind of monsters they were. Kung Wu was convinced that the level had actually increased by 3 points and energy by 1, and it wasn't just an increase in numbers, he felt like his body had become stronger. He looked silently at the fallen goblins again. Now he needs to find out what kind of place this is. Earth or not, but do at least people live here? Kung Wu stretched out his hand towards the dead goblins and barely opened his mouth, activating the power of the devourer. The dark power emanating from the youth's hands completely enveloped the dead goblins' bodies. He remembered that he could learn something from their bodies, but the information he wanted to know about this place was not there. Suddenly, a notification appeared that the dark energy level had increased by 1, causing concern to appear on the guy's face. He cursed silently, thinking, if there was energy here that only existed in hell, then this probably wasn't Earth at all. He clutched his head in despair. The reason he wanted to become the strongest in hell was so he could return to Earth one day. His thoughts went back to that long period of time when all he did was fight. A loud sound pulled him out of his thoughts. It was a cry that came from far away. The young man's face cleared again, and he turned in that direction. He immediately thought that this was not the voice of a monster or a demon. Kung Wu intuitively sensed it. It was definitely a human scream. Kong's body trembled. It seemed as if the scream that reached his ears helped to cheer him up. He activated the acceleration power, the power that the demon Valar had used in life, and then it passed to Kung Wu, and he rushed towards where he heard the scream. For over 10,000 years, he has only seen tentacles and monsters with multiple arms and legs. He no longer cares what this person looks like, as long as he has 2 eyes and a mouth. Let him not have tentacles. Kung Wu rushed like an arrow. By human standards, it was an incredible speed, but for him, such speed was a burden. Again mentally asking for there to be no tentacles, the guy thought. Although he imagined Lilith's ugly tentacles, he concentrated on the energy that was now concentrated in his legs. Thinking about what he had found, he looked ahead. Coming out of the dense forest, a wasteland stretched out before him, and there about a dozen goblins surrounded the girl, causing her to scream in terror. There, among the crowd of monsters, stood a girl. The guy started examining her. 2 eyes, 1 nose, 1 mouth, this is a human. He noticed with some surprise that there were no tentacles, no festering tentacles, no bat-like wings, no monster covered in a bleeding cloak. This was an ordinary man. Kung Wu was so happy about this that he began to cry with joy. Meanwhile, the goblins had already raised their hands to kill the girl. The girl, looking at the goblins running around her, closed her eyes in horror. Feeling that there was no one around and hearing some sounds, she opened her eyes in surprise, wanting to see what was happening. She looked straight at Kung Wu, the guy who had brutally killed a herd of over 10 goblins in just a few seconds. Having killed the goblins, the young man ran to the surprised girl sitting on the ground, and without saying a word, he extended his hand to her. She accepted his help and, despite her wounded legs, stood up and thanked him. Taking her hand, it was as if an electric charge ran through the guy's body. He had never experienced such pleasant sensations before. The sensations he was receiving now excited his consciousness. These sensations blocked out all the others, completely occupying his mind, which made him flinch a little, ignoring the girl who seemed about to say something. She looked at Kung Wu, who was holding her, but didn't try to free herself. Instead, just nodded again in gratitude, introducing herself and saying that her name was Han Sol. But noticing that he did not react to her words in any way, continuing to purse his lips and shake, the girl said that if he had any difficulties, but she didn't have time to finish her thought because the guy pulled her towards him, who looked at her with burning eyes and made her a sincere proposal to marry him. She awkwardly tried to answer him, but she couldn't formulate her thoughts properly. Having unexpectedly received an offer, she didn't understand whether she should be angry or thank the guy. Kong Wu's common sense returned, and he quickly removed his hands and apologized, introducing himself with an awkward smile, saying that his name was Kong Wu, and then asked again if her name was really Han Sol. When asked about the condition of her wound and whether it hurt much, the girl answered with a smile that it did not hurt much. But suddenly, the pain from the wound made her cry out, and her legs, one of which was wounded, gave way. The guy immediately caught her and asked if she was okay. At that moment, a rectangular object fell out of her pocket. The boy's eyes widened in surprise when he realized what kind of rectangle it was. He was sure it was a smartphone, a thing he still had vague memories of, so it was definitely Earth. The guy put her on the ground, telling her to sit down and not to strain, as at least first aid was needed. Soa belatedly thanked him. To which Kong Wu replied with a smile that there was no need for thanks. The ability to communicate was proof that this was Earth. Kung Wu tore his clothes and tied them around the girl's leg, remembering his stay in hell, where, in order not to forget the Korean language, Kung Wu forbade the servants to use the language of the devil and taught them the basics of the Korean language. He thought to himself that despite this, he was glad that he could speak Korean to a human, and then said that she should feel better now. Looking down, the girl thanked him again for his concern, although the girl was suspicious of such kindness. The guy said with a smile that there was nothing to thank her for, and taking her phone in his hands, handed it over, saying that it was her smartphone. Suddenly, he was attracted by the numbers on the girl's phone, he thought. Never having responded to the words of gratitude from the girl who took him, 2023, it turns out that he ended up in the near future, and only 5 years have passed since he ended up in hell. He hadn't made a mistake in timing then. Kong Wu didn't understand what could have happened to the earth in just 5 years for monsters to start walking freely through the forest. Kong Wu turned to the girl and said that since it would be difficult for her to move, it would be better to rest a little. Oh, and I thought again, nothing was clear. So the guy turned to Han Sol and asked what she was doing here. She replied that for some reason she had to hunt without a team. Hano continued to answer more sluggishly. Looking down, she said that she was still a complete newbie, but she decided to go through the gate to level E, which was stupid. Kong Wu's eyes lit up. The words about the gate and the players implied that they were no longer on Earth. But on one of the levels, he casually asked what her level was. She replied that she was new, so only 6, and in return asked what he was doing there. Thinking that his level was even lower, the guy belatedly replied that he had his own reasons for being there, and I thought that she could come up with whatever she wanted. However, the girl only replied that she understood and accidentally touched his shoulder with her shoulder, after which she immediately timidly moved away from the guy, not understanding what had happened. She then stood up, motioning for them to go to the gate. Kun Wu said that she had a serious injury and asked if she was okay. She replied that everything was fine, thanks to him. But then pain shot through her knee again, causing her to groan. Kong grabbed the swaying girl's hand, saying that he would support her. The girl blushed and said excitedly that it wasn't worth it, and she didn't want to cause more trouble. The guy calmly replied that there was no need to refuse if she needed help, and he would take her where she needed to go. Han Sol awkwardly tilted her head, and her face turned red, and when asked in which direction, she said to the gate. The guy said with a friendly smile that he understood. Kongu hugged the girl tighter, and they walked at a leisurely pace, and he was completely immersed in his thoughts. He had not made a single mistake, and at least it did not arouse any suspicions in her. Now it was necessary to blend in with the local population. They stopped and looked up in admiration. Hansol said that they had arrived. They approached the gate on the tree. Its height was about 30 meters. Compared to the black gate that Kung Wu came out of, this gate was many times larger and more powerful. Kung Wu looked back and thought that if she came here through the gate, then the forest with the goblins definitely did not belong to Earth. And he did not see any weapon that created these gates, and did not understand how they functioned. Suddenly, the girl called out to him and said that she thought she was feeling better. Kong Wu quickly removed his hand from her shoulder, and she invited him to come with her. They entered the gate and their bodies moved along the tunnel with extraordinary ease. Kung Wu covered his face with his hands just in case. He opened his eyes, looking in surprise at the landscape before him, noticing that the people there had 2 eyes, 1 nose, 1 mouth, and no tentacles. It seemed they were in a marketplace. Someone shouted that they were gathering a squad on level E and would hunt goblins. Others said with surprise and disappointment that there seemed to be no tanks today. One of them asked the other if he needed a robber. He apologized, but said that he didn't need them. Kong Wu looked at the people gathered at the entrance of the gate and again felt a slight tingling in his chest. What he desired so much was surrounded by people on all sides. He trembled again under the girl's surprised gaze. He couldn't believe that all this was real. Now he clearly realized that he had returned. The remnants of anxiety gradually dissipated, and in their place came satisfaction and joy, which made him cry. Hano continued to look at him in surprise, when suddenly her leg made itself known again. Hano called the boy gently, and he turned to face her. Then she leaned over and asked if he had time, and in a guilty voice she asked if he could come to dinner. Kunwu shuddered and blushed at such an unexpected offer. Turning away, she sheepishly continued to explain, saying that she would like to thank him and perhaps invite him to dinner. Kunwu clenched his fists. A strong desire spread through his body, and he blushed at his imagination. Kang Bayu's eyes sparkled, and he said that it would be impolite to refuse, so he would gladly accept her invitation. Suddenly they were called and told to wait. At that moment, two men who were at the gate approached them, and one of them asked to show their player's ID. At the man's request, Han Sol casually pulled out her ID card from her bosom, and the guy looked at them with distrust. They also contacted him and asked him to provide documents. Kang Wu's expression changed, and he became tense. He said that of course he would show it now and reached into his pocket with a serious expression, immediately activating his power, the power of illusion. Thanks to her, the interlocutor's consciousness should have become clouded, and he should have seen what was needed. It was precisely the power of the demon Dantalion. Under the influence of the power, he showed the guard the middle finger. The uniformed man's gaze dimmed for a moment. He looked at him and nodded slowly. He reported that the identity was confirmed. The check lasted literally a second. Kung Wu, holding back his heavy breathing, lowered his hand and, ignoring the inspector's strange behavior, suggested that Han Sol go already. She agreed, and they turned away from the inspector and walked towards Han Sol's house. Following Han Sol, they came to a dilapidated building, and she said that it was her house. Not only did her house look old, but so did all the others in the area. As they entered the building, the girl turned to him and said that they didn't have an elevator, so they would have to do some legwork. Kang quickly replied that it was nothing. He smiled happily as he smelled the good old scent of a residential building. The stairs he walked on were narrow. The railing he touched was cold. The window was dusty. But he paid no attention to the inconvenience, rejoicing that he really felt all this. His eyes sparkled again, especially since among the many regions of the earth, Seoul was located there, and now a happy future awaited him. He was already imagining their future happy life together, which excited me again, but Han Sol didn't pay any attention to him, greeting her mother with a smile as she opened the door. Slowly, Kang Wu's clouded mind began to clear. Why was there a sad expression on his face now? If it was her mother, then she really did invite him to dinner just now. An exhausted middle-aged woman ran out to meet them, and, taking Han Sol by the shoulders, she began to ask if everything was okay with her and if she had found a match for herself. To her question, the girl hesitantly, looking away from all the questions, answered, "Of course." She then looked at Kang Wu and hurriedly continued, saying that it was Kang Wu who saved her, and so she decided to thank him. The guy bowed his head and greeted the woman who didn't immediately notice him. The middle-aged woman grabbed Kang Wu's hands and bowed her head in gratitude. She continued to thank Kang Wu for helping Sholei and said that she didn't even know how to repay him for his kindness. Kang Wu laughed awkwardly and asked her not to worry about it because everything was fine. The guy was greeted warmly and invited into the house. She asked him to come in and said that their house was not the most luxurious, but she would cook him something tasty. The guy thanked the woman with a smile and went into the house. Although he was sorry that they did not have dinner together, but compared to hell, it was much better there, so he had nothing to complain about. As they walked further, the woman asked Sola to help her with cooking. Hano immediately agreed, having warned that she would first quickly change her clothes and wash up. The girl turned her attention to the phone and asked her mother if she was really writing to her, in response to which she asked her not to forget to contact her when the opportunity arose. Despite how she apologized to her mother, Kang Wu remembered about his cell phone and how he needed to get more information about Earth, so he hesitantly called out to Solai, and then he continued in a calm voice, asking if he could borrow her phone, as he had lost his somewhere. The girl quickly agreed, and then handed her smartphone to Kang Wu, telling him not to be shy and to make himself at home. Kang Wu took the phone that was offered to him and quickly thanked her. He looked at the phone with admiration and then ran his finger across it, thinking about how nice it felt to run his finger across the screen, and how exciting it was to experience the same sensations as 10,000 years ago. Placing his coat on a chair, he sat down in the next chair at the table, mentally telling himself not to get distracted because he needed to learn more first. Thinking that it had only been 5 years since he had gone to hell, he opened his browser and decided to start with the news for 2018. One of the first articles he came across spoke of radical changes on February 22nd, 2018, The earth became unrecognizable. Unknown monsters were breaking out of hundreds of gates that appeared all over the earth. Firearms are useless against them. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers were brutally killed. The United States has put forward a proposal to create a global coalition to quickly respond to emergencies, with South Korea becoming the 9th country to join the alliance. Then came the questions about who were the first players to appear in America, and whether the sharp increase in the number of players across the planet has been beneficial, whether they can be considered the hope of humanity. Kun Wu frowned as he slowly looked through the articles, and then he came across the first article about it, dated February 22nd, 2018. He looked at it in shock. February 22nd, 2018 is the day the gates appeared all over the world and also the day he went to hell. It turns out he was simply dragged into one of the many gates. If you think about it, that's probably true. Kong Wu searched for information about his gate, but there was no fundamental detailed description of the gate on the internet, only guesses. So he decided to look into it seriously later. Suddenly he was called out and told that lunch was ready. The guy put the phone down with a smile and was about to thank him for lunch. But then he hesitated. The guy's eyes widened in disbelief. There was a large, deep pot of kimchi chiga on the table, the aroma of which spread throughout the room. The broth bubbled seductively. The red kimchi smelled fragrant, and the piece of meat lying on top tempted the guy. Kun Wu stared at kimchi chig. He continued to look at the frying pan, or rather at its contents, not even paying attention to the wish for a pleasant appetite. With trembling hands, he took the spoon and carried it to the saucepan, and then carefully scooped up some broth from the edge and took a piece of tofu. Ignoring the guy, the mother invited her daughter to eat too, and she quickly agreed. But suddenly her attention was drawn to a guy who repeated the name of the dish in a trembling voice, syllable by syllable. With trembling hands, he slowly raised the spoon with the dish to his mouth. The mother and daughter stared in surprise at the boy in front of them. "I quickly chew one spoonful of soup." He grabbed another one and ate it just as quickly. And then he took the rice and, taking a large spoon, ate it. The young man devoured the dish prepared for him with such gusto that the crunching sound resounded throughout the house, and Han Sol and her mother, who were sitting opposite him, were discouraged by such gluttony. But he paid no attention to them, lost in his memories of how he ended up in hell 10,000 years ago. And in order to survive in this place, he had to accept the dark energy. After that, he became a creature close to demons. However, this happened because there was still something of the human in him, his appetite and taste. No food could satisfy him. The demons he devoured tasted terrible, but he still continued to eat them to survive. Even after this madness has been repeated countless times over 10,000 years, there was only one thing that motivated him. He desperately wanted to return to Earth. The guy was crying, gobbling up the food. He still couldn't believe that he had actually returned to Earth. Han Seol and his mother, looking in shock at the sobbing boy eating kimchi jjigae, tried to call out to him through their tears. In response, he turned to her with his mouth full. And then, without raising his head, he began to repeat to her his gratitude for the food, not forgetting to say that it was very tasty. The girl was momentarily confused. And then, looking down in embarrassment, she said that it was she who should thank him, and she wishes she could thank him only with food. But he eats with such gusto that she wonders if it really tastes that good. Kong Wu replied that it was true and nodded his head several times in confirmation, then awkwardly asked for another bowl of rice. The girl stood up and said that of course she would put it down now. Without responding to his gratitude, the woman noted with a laugh that he had a good appetite. He ate the food offered to him with tears in his eyes, thinking only about how delicious it was and how great it was to be back. She brought the slow cooker with a new portion of food, continuing to look at him with love. At that moment, the door slammed into the wall behind Kong Wu, who, unlike the others, didn't even flinch. A silhouette emerged from the cloud of dust and asked rudely, "What the hell?" When Han Sol and her mother approached, he was frightened and explained his behavior by saying that something had jammed the door, and stepping on one of the fallen stones, he entered inside. The young man, swearing rudely and very angrily, loudly called out to Han Sol. He twisted his face into a grin and stood in front of Han Sol, rudely stating that she had entered the gate alone without his permission. Han Sol looked at her brother with disgust. When her brother appeared, she began to tremble slightly, but despite this, she stuttered and tried to tell him something. A creepy grin appeared on Tae Hong's face, and he asked what she wanted to say. Hanul, despite her mother's warnings, shouted loudly at him to get out and leave, and then in the same tone asked what he had forgotten in their house. She continued to speak, looking straight into the face of the discouraged boy, that she warned him not to come close, and now she too is a full-fledged player. Hearing this, Tan simply laughed loudly. Han Sol fell silent, looking at him in surprise. He gradually laughed even harder, asking if she had become a full-fledged player, and mockingly said that it was cool. And then he hit the wall hard, leaving a mark there, saying that she was just a underscore underscore, underscore underscore, and a noob. He asked what kind of player he was. The girl screamed, "Don't come any closer," shielding her frightened mother. The guy looked at her arrogantly, remembering how he once shook with fear, unable to do anything. And then he turned and said mockingly, "A father who died early, and a mother who was good for nothing." However, Han Sol didn't let him finish, furiously shouting that he was a scumbag. And how could he say that if it was all because of him? She clenched her fists even tighter and swung. Tan stopped the fist heading towards him with a light movement of his hand. Pain spread throughout her entire body, but he paid no attention to it and, saying that they would immediately go to the Andres Guild, pulled her towards the exit. He dragged her along, ignoring her attempts to break free and her words that she would not go to this dump. To this, he asked with a smile who she called trash and said that her brother had put together a great guild. Realizing that it would not be possible to get out so easily, the girl decided to take desperate measures, and without saying a word, she grabbed the hand that held her with her teeth and bit it until it bled. The guy screamed and threw the girl away from him with one blow. Hano fell limply to the floor with a loud thud. Her mother immediately ran to her in fear. Meanwhile, Tahan was clutching the bleeding wound on his hand and calling loudly for Sola, underscore underscore. And then, with fury in his voice, he asked her if she thought that if she always did the right thing, life would be easier, and if she thought the world was that simple. He looked at the women hugging each other in fear and said that she would be a good girl and would be his property. With a depressing aura, he said darkly, "Well, since they are both players, they should do it right at least once." Hearing this, his old mother tried to intervene and asked him to stop, not to touch Sola, and said that he would sort everything out. The mother tried to call him and take his hand, but he only roughly ordered her to move away. He then pulled his hand back and roughly pushed her to the ground, saying that she was really annoying him. Hanul turned to her with tears in her eyes, and then, still crying, she crawled to her mother and began to shake her, hoping to bring her to her senses. Tahun was not at all touched by this picture. He only said that if he said to move away, then she should move away. He didn't feel any remorse or anything like that. So he just asked why he had to be provoked. Hano looked at him angrily and called him by his full name. She continued to look menacingly at the guy, without ceasing to hold her mother's head. Tahun asked what underscore underscore someone like her would do to him. After all, she's a newbie, and he was the second to awaken. He came up to her and said with a crazy smile that she was not his opponent. Taking her face, he continued to mockingly ask what she could do, since she had nothing but a beautiful face. She must join Andre's guild, then his brothers will promote him. Hearing some strange sounds, he quickly fell silent and raised his head in surprise. See Kung Woo in the living room, eating kimchi with crazy pleasure. Gradually getting irritated again, he looked at the guy who was not paying attention to him and asked what the hell. But the young man was so focused on his food that he didn't care about Tai Hong's indignation. Tai Hong pushed the girl aside and asked irritably if they had a restaurant there. After giving a few more gentle kisses, he moved towards Kang Woo, saying that he didn't seem to understand what was going on. The boy continued eating, not paying attention to Taehan approaching and calling him. He ate and ate with bliss, closing his eyes, not paying attention to anything. Taehan walked away from him and awkwardly scratched his neck, wondering what he should do about it. He suddenly lost his temper and swung at Kang Woo, who was ignoring him. But instead of hitting the guy, he flipped the table over with one kick. The guy froze, not immediately understanding what exactly had happened. Hano, looking at this with tears in her eyes, covered her face with her hand in horror. Tahan just looked at this with irritation, not feeling any remorse for what he had done. Kung Woo sat for a while with a spoon in his hand, which he never raised to his mouth, and stared blankly ahead. Hano called out to him excitedly, hoping to bring him to his senses. Kung Woo suddenly screamed for his kimchi jig, looking at the soup spilled on the floor, and then he fell on all fours, still crying. Tung did not like this violent reaction, and cursing loudly, he asked what it was. And he asked the bewildered Hana where she found this bastard. She, in turn, did not answer anything. Tun's face twisted and he turned to the crying boy, still cursing. Then he kicked him in the side and told him to stop crying and get up. Kung Wu slowly turned his head towards Tung, rage flaring up inside him. Meeting Kung Wu's gaze, Tong suddenly took a step back, trying to figure out what it was. His eyes scared and drove me crazy, empty and dark. They were like the deepest abyss. Tung found the right word to describe this look of the guy who darkly asked if he dared to splash it on Kim Chi-gu. This was definitely not a man or a beast, but a demon. He continued to look at Kang Wu, who was radiating a terrifying energy, with fear, and only repeated the words about his kimchi chiga. Tahan took a deep breath, bit his lip, and braced himself. Suddenly, the evil energy that had been in the air before evaporated. Blue flames sparked on his palms, and he clenched them into fists as both of his fists were now on fire. The air temperature rose so much that it seemed that just a little more, and the whole house would catch fire. He looked at the guy haughtily, thinking that he must have imagined it, and said that he was actually __ furious. As soon as Tahan waved his hand slightly, the fire consumed the arrow flying towards his head. With a menacing expression on his face, he turned towards the direction from which the arrow was fired. Soul X fired another arrow and shouted loudly at Kung Wu to run away. However, her eyes immediately widened in confusion. Kung Wu, rushing past her, jerked to the side with a sharp movement and dodged the attack. A black blade appeared from the back of Kung Wu's hand, which he swung to strike. Hanul, holding the stick at arm's length, stared in shock at the painting in front of her. Tahun, concentrating on the blade, rushed forward, intending to strike. At that moment, Kong Wu, with a sharp movement of his hand, struck his enemy in the solar plexus. This made Tahun curse harshly, and notice that he wasn't that fast. Kung Wu swung his sword again, this time intending to strike from the left. But this time, Kung Wu kneed him in the stomach, knocking the wind out of him. From the very beginning, the blade and this blow were nothing more than a distraction. Thinking about this, Tahun tried to quickly come to his senses. Closing his mouth and clenching his teeth until they crunched, he stood up again. Tung, continuing to speak rudely, swung at Kong Wu again, but he quickly moved out of the way of the blow and kicked Tahun in the back. Tahun, gritting his teeth and not paying attention to the streams of blood flowing from his nose, again holding his stomach, thought that he was not so strong. He rushed forward and grabbed Kun Wu's leg with one hand and swung the other to strike. Kong Wu, in turn, delivered a swift kick to the face, leaving him no chance to hit himself. And then, freeing his leg, he jumped to the ground. Tahun watched him with irritation, ignoring the bruises on his face and the blood pouring from his nose. Kung Wu swung his black blade at him again. Tahun fell for the trick again, and with loud curses, his hands filled with blue fire, he swung back. Kang Wu dodged the blow and kicked. This blow knocked the wind out of him again. He couldn't believe that this was another diversion, but Kong Wu didn't stop there and hit him again. Having received it, he collapsed on the living room floor. Pale Tang held his stomach, not daring to look at Kong Wu, who was looking down at him with some kind of eerie energy. He couldn't figure out who this guy was. Suddenly his face hit the floor with great force. Kong Wu stepped on Tahun's head, sending his trembling body to the floor. Tahun's attempts to rise were ultimately unsuccessful, but he was not about to give up so easily. Saying that he wasn't finished yet, Kang Wu pierced his hand with the black sword, an inhuman scream echoing throughout the entire house. Kun Wu knelt down right in front of his head and gradually pulled the knife out of Tahun's hand. And in a dark voice, he said that he would have to pay for the upside-down Kim Chuch Chigu. Tahun, breathing heavily, raised his head, looked at him with hatred and asked if it was really because of Kim Chiga. It was just soup. Kung Wu lifted Tahun's head by his hair and angrily asked if he really said it was just soup. He grabbed the boy by the hair, who was shaking with terror, and asked him gloomily if he was serious when he said that Kim Chiga was just soup. Tahun timidly tried to justify his words, but Kang Wu didn't listen to him, and again slammed his face into the floor with all his might. He began to violently slap his face on the floor, constantly asking loudly if he really said that about Kim Chiga. Kung Wu clenched his teeth in irritation until they crunched, and then he slowly let go of the guy's hair. He leaned towards his ear and began to say that when he spoke once, he would say Kim Chiga, and when he says two, he will answer with the blessed dish and nothing else. Tahun placed his trembling hands on the floor beneath him. He spoke once, and Tan said the word Kimiga. Kun Wu felt like he was speaking softly. He forcefully pressed the blade deeper into Tan's hand, ignoring his inhuman scream, and ordered him to speak louder. And he repeated the first order once more. Tahun, no longer holding back his tears, cleared his throat, and under the mad gaze of Kun Wu, he loudly repeated his words. He repeated the second order. Unable to look into the crazy eyes of the guy looking at him, He said that it was a blessed dish. Kong Wu was not satisfied with this answer, and his expression became even more terrifying. He shouted loudly at him to say these words even louder, like a believer praying to God and like a man caring for his girlfriend. Hana watched the unfolding scene in surprise, but said not a word. The guy, in a rage, ordered her brother to speak louder and more expressively. Her brother, with tears in his eyes, tried to carry out the order, but the guy was not doing well, so he lost his temper even more, clenching his teeth in anger so much that they crunched. Kyu didn't have the right tone. He leaned over and shouted that it was too loud. He should raise his voice to the 7th octave. The guy hesitated for a second, raising his head, and then, again with all his might, he shouted that kimchi jjigae was a sacred dish. He put all his remaining strength into this shout. The guy sitting above his head finally calmed down, and after these words, everything became quiet. Now Kong Wu was satisfied, so he slowly stood up, taking the knife out of his shoulder. He wasn't planning on going anywhere yet, so he stood right above the guy's head and looked at him as if he was trash under his feet when he told him that he would never dare to neglect kimchi jjigae again. Tan let out a breath and started sobbing, tears and snot pouring out of him, and soon it was all a mess on his face. All he could think about was how crazy this guy was. The house finally became quiet, and no one disturbed the silence. After a while, the tables and broken furniture were already cleared away. All the broken furniture was stacked in boxes and stood at the entrance, waiting to be taken to the dump. The mother of the girl and the boy lay unconscious on the bed, not paying attention to the fact that her head was being bandaged. Han Sol, who was doing this, looked at the woman sadly, and then she turned her head towards the kitchen. There, someone was carefully washing dishes under high-pressure water. Pursing his lips in resentment, the guy still couldn't understand why everything happened this way, and why everything ended this way. Without turning around to look at Kong Wu, who was sitting right behind him, the guy washed the dishes and tried to figure out where his sister had found this psychopath. He had beaten him up just because of some kimiga. Kun Wu didn't pay any attention to him, calmly sipping his drink from his cup and leisurely scrolling through something on his phone. Suddenly tears flowed from Tahan's eyes. He still felt sorry for himself and considered Kangwoo Kim Chigza a crazy son, __. As he washed the dishes, he continued to think with anger and disappointment about what he had done to deserve this. Turning around and glaring at Kong Wu, he asked himself why he had to put up with this at all. However, as soon as Kong Wu slammed the cup of drink down on the table, Tahan jumped, hiccuped in fear, and returned to his work. Kung Wu, without looking in his direction, indifferently asked if he thought Kung Wu was crazy, if he was reacting like that just because of some kimchi jjigae. The guy fearfully replied that he didn't think so. Then Kun Wu looked at him with red eyes, realizing the lie in his words but did not comment on it. Instead, tell the scared guy that he can dress nicely, sleep a lot, eat well and rest comfortably, do what he likes and not what will help him survive, but he does not know how to appreciate what he has. In a didactic tone, he told Taehan to learn to appreciate what he had. I thought to myself that he was just being vain, __. The guy answered loudly and said that he understood him, and he turned to the sink, thinking to himself that he would regret having gotten involved with him. In any case, once he reported this to Andras, he would be dealt with quickly. Suddenly, Gai Kun Wu called out to him again, ordering him to come to him if he finished washing the dishes. Then Kong Wu himself stood up, leaning on the table, and said that in his opinion he would not gain anything by saving Tahan's life. The boy listened with fear to Kung Wu's words that he did not understand that doing the right thing would not make life easier. Kung Wu came closer and grabbed the guy by the collar of his shirt, and looking into his eyes, he told him not to worry because he was not going to die. He did not feel sorry for Tahun, but even though murder was already in his blood, he did not want it now. But his eyes grew even more creepy as he grinned and said that he thought death would have been a more desirable outcome for him. Tun stopped making any sounds and now watched helplessly as what was happening in front of him. Kang Wu activated the power of the demon Ouroboros, the power of fear. The person who is subjected to this Ouroboros power has fear in his soul, and he turns into a puppet who will not even think of resisting this monster. He grabbed the resisting guy in his arms. Tahun looked straight into the monster's eyes and begged him not to touch him. But he didn't seem to listen to him, and vice versa. He did not take his huge red eyes off him. Taehyun's heartbreaking voice showed that he no longer had any strength, but he still tried to resist. Tahun wet himself and looked at Kong Wu as if he was crazy. The guy grinned ominously at Tahun and told him not to tell anyone what happened there. Kun Wu looked at him darkly and without a trace of a smile, ordered him to go out and try to stay out of his sight. Kong Wu sat down on a chair and lazily waved his hand. The boy was in his power. Even under torture, he would not tell anyone anything. Tang, looking completely broken, staggered and walked out. Hano, seeing him come out, silently looked towards Kong Wu and thought that this was the second time Kong Wu saved her. He saved her from Tahun, who had been tormenting her for several years. She didn't know how she could thank Kong Wu. The guy, meanwhile, paid no attention to her, burying his face in his phone. He calmly scrolled through the feed and occasionally clicked his finger on the screen. Suddenly, he remembered what Tahun had told him and realized that what was really bothering him was that he was __ a beggar. With these thoughts and the thought that he needed to find a job because he needed money, he began scrolling through his feed twice as fast, not paying attention to the girl who looked at him like he was a deity. Suddenly, he noticed something interesting with surprise. It was an article about the magic stone, which said that it was a stone trapped inside a monster and was a powerful source of energy. The darker the stone, the higher its price. Kung Wu turned to the girl and called her name. She responded immediately and happily. The boy asked if she had a magic stone and if he could look at it. The girl replied, "Of course you can," and began rummaging through her bag. Taking out the stone, she handed it over to the boy, saying that it was a magical EL stone obtained from the goblin hunting grounds. Kong Wu picked up her E-level mask and thought about an article on the internet that said the darker the stone, the higher the level of its owner. Kung Wu, holding the EGR stone in his hands, closed his eyes, concentrating on reading the information inside the stone. Suddenly, he realized that he did not feel any dark magic within himself. He opened his eyes thinking there was something in the stone, but it was something else. The boy remembered the moment when he devoured the energy of the goblins. Although the goblins' bodies were weak, they contained dark energy. He expected that the origin of goblins and magic stones were the same, and that the stones would also contain dark magic, but he was wrong. These stones contained a different energy. It wasn't dark magic, but rather regular magic, a different energy. Kong Wu thought about it. He didn't understand where it came from. After all, he used the power of absorption not long ago. He didn't even think that monsters had dark energy, and didn't ask where they got it from at that moment. But now it's too late. Thinking that it was no longer important, he returned the stone to the girl with a smile, not forgetting to thank her. Now what was more important to him was how to start making money by selling these things. He remembered what had happened the day before and realized what he needed to do to achieve his goals. And then he turned to Kong Sol, asking if there was a players' association nearby. She replied in surprise that there were definitely no such people nearby, but there was a headquarters at Seoul Station. And she quickly told the guy, getting up from her chair, that she needed to go there too, not forgetting to offer to go together. In response to his surprised question as to why she needed to go there too, she looked back at her mother and explained that, in fact, their situation was not very good. Looking at the stone in her hand, she continued to say that she realized that she lacked the skills. Even if it took time, she would like to learn it before her next trip to the gate. Then she looked up at Kong Wu and said that it was only thanks to him that she understood all this and thanked him again. The guy once again replied that it was not worth thanking. When she said that she also wanted to help people like him, the guy just smiled. Meanwhile, Han Sol continued to talk about learning the basics, focusing on the second awakening. The guy replied that he hoped that everything would work out for her and asked when they would leave. Hanul said that now she would get ready and be able to go. The guy thought while he was waiting for her. For 10,000 years he saw demons, and then he met an angel. But for now he doesn't plan to help Sola, maybe later, now. Given her skills, the harm will be many times greater than the benefit. It's cruel, but it's necessary, and it's reality. He needs to get rid of the ballast that is dragging him down and regain his strength as quickly as possible. In a hell full of powerful demons, he was a weak man at the very bottom. In order to survive in such a place, he had to become calculating. Of course, over time, the number of demons he devoured increased, and he began to be respected. But the habits did not disappear. First of all, he needed his power back. Han Sol came up behind me and startled the guy standing by the window by asking if he had an ID. And when I didn't hear anything in response, I suggested that we go to the administration first. He looked a little sadly at the new ID card standing in the transport next to Han Sol. He thought it was his new ID. Before going to the player support center, Kong Wu went to the district government office to get an ID card, and when he was given one, he asked the employee if that was all. She replied that that was all and asked if he had any questions. He replied with an awkward smile that he had no questions and apologized for disturbing me. He looked at the ID with a sad expression on his face. How alone he was. How sad his life was. That no one even reported him missing. No one just knew that he was gone. He disappeared from Earth for 5 years. Time went on as usual, and he was not listed as missing. No one reported him missing during this time. No one knew what happened to him and what he had to go through during all these years. He was pulled out of his thoughts and memories by a female voice calling his name. Seeing that she had caught his attention, Han Sol kindly invited him to look out the window and admire the scenery. Kung Wu obediently turned his head towards the window. Kung Wu made a sound of admiration. The place where Han Sol lives can hardly be called a city, but this place is completely different. The girl, hearing his exclamation, asked if it was cool there and said that she really liked the view from there. Kung Wu agreed with her, putting the ID card in his pocket. He decided for himself that from now on, everything would be different. He had no intention of returning to his old way of life, having lived like a dog for 10,000 years. Finally turning his attention to the girl, he said once again that this was all very cool. The dispatcher announced their car's arrival at the Players Association station, and just in case, repeated several times that the exit was on the left. When they came out, the girl immediately called out to him, indicating which way they should go. Kong Wu let out a cry of delight. He looked at the huge masses of people moving around the station, and then Kong Wu looked in the direction Han Sol pointed. He looked at the place called the Player Support Center in shock. He thought it was much bigger than the Ina International Airport building. It was unbelievable that they built a building of such a size in the very center of the city. It was scary to even imagine how much money was invested in it. Han Sol called out to him, taking something out of her bag, saying that she had something special for him. That something was the phone that was given to him, which the girl said was her old phone. The association has Wei, so she will contact him later. For the guy at that moment, she seemed like something like an angel. He thanked her with respect. After finishing, Han Sol turned around and said that in that case, she would go to the basic level classes, to which Kong Wu replied that he would go too and would call her when he was done, saying that she would probably be a little late. The girl, a little shyly, invited him to have dinner together. The guy happily agreed and saying that it was a great idea, asked her to be careful. After parting with Han Sol, Kong Wu entered the department building. He immediately thought that it had serious dimensions. He looked around and at the people, trying to figure out if the players had really become that important to society. Well, it could be if they were considered saviors. Suddenly, his gaze fell on the device, which announced that in order to pass identification, it was necessary to insert his ID card into it. The guy thought that with the help of this device, he could get the ticket he needed. The machine repeated its words once more before Kong Wu inserted his ID card into it, and the recognition process began. A few seconds later, the machine said the process was complete. His identity was confirmed, and he was 18th in line, after which she gave me a ticket and told me to take it. The guy looked in surprise at the coupon in the machine, which repeated to him the need to take the coupon and go to the testing room. The talent in his hands was shaking violently, which surprised him even more. Suddenly, a light appeared under his feet, and the machine repeated its turn again. Kong Wu took the ticket handed to him and headed in the right direction. In front of the entrance to the testing room, there were several guys sitting very excitedly. Some talked to each other about the skills they had acquired and what they hoped to achieve in the future. Kong Wu didn't pay attention to their conversations. Sitting on the sofa with his back to them, one of the men said that even if he reached B rank, he was worthless compared to players like Baek Kangan and Cha Younggu. It is said that they were at S level when they reached rank 1. Of course, they can't be compared to them. Kong Wu quickly typed something on his phone. Finally, listening to their conversation, he understood from it that the level of the special skill is very important. In fact, the player's class is determined by the level of the special skill. One of the men summed it up by saying that how could they even compare themselves to those who had rank up and become the master of the largest guild? If you got to rank C, you might be invited to one of the 5 great guilds, but I can't even dream of that. Maybe someday later. The guy read the articles and thought, the 5 great guilds are Kim Jae-hoon from Mir, Chi Yeonju from Red Rose, Baek Kangan from Hanwell, Chen Hoon Woo and Sonari, and Cha Min-hyuk from Minori. All 5 of the strongest players founded their guilds in Korea. Once he regains his strength, it will only be a matter of time before he meets them. The stronger you become, the more enemies you have, there is a high probability that he may have a conflict with them. The most important thing for him is to regain his strength as soon as possible, and the rest can wait. If you click on the player's property, the status window will open, so you can check the special skill. Maybe it can become stronger than before. The S-level feature above it is the SS level. How strong the SS level is, Kong Wu couldn't even imagine. But nothing compares to the power of devouring. Kong Wu was called at the number and told that he could enter the office. Kong Wu followed the voice that called him to the testing room. There was a huge crowd of people inside, and the woman who approached him asked him to come and sit at the table she pointed to. There was a snow-white lens installed there. The players put their hands on it and were very excited. Another woman sitting at the table asked if he was Kun Wu. He replied that everything was correct. The woman then showed him the ball closer and told him to put his hand on it, explaining that when the ball caught his power, the stone would turn the color of his level. The higher the level, the darker the shade. The guy extended his hand, thinking that it would not be very good to stand out. What to do if he turned out to be too strong? Without hesitation, he placed his hands on the stone, which immediately began to glow slightly. And then he began to blow a bright white light that blinded his eyes. Kong Wu closed his eyes, thinking that it was perhaps a little too bright. The girl just sat there, not saying a word, looking at that bright light. And when he stopped, she looked at the ball without much enthusiasm. The woman said in a casual voice that he had normal F-level strength and could remove his hand. She looked at the stone that had barely changed its color and wrote something down on the piece of paper she was holding. The guy opened his eyes in shock, not believing what he heard. The woman told him that she would tell him what was best to pay attention to. As a player below level D, he knows that his power is sealed. Kong Wu shook his head as the result was very different from what he expected. Still, level F is somehow quite dull. The woman explained in the meantime that after first obtaining a level E player ID, one can freely enter the level E gates. To enter the higher level gates, one must write a statement of acceptance of responsibility and provide a guardian's statement. Kong Wu still had hope that perhaps he was so strong that the stone simply couldn't measure his strength. And hearing about the guardian, he thought ironically that Pak would be furious if he heard that. But still, it was the trauma of 10,000 years. He was no longer distracted by such thoughts, asking how he could level up. The girl said that if he completed basic training, he would immediately receive level D. Also, the level can be increased with a certain amount of magic stones. The guy heard this and immediately thought that he liked this method better. He then stood up from the table saying he understood everything. The girl told him to go to the counter and wait a little while they prepared his player's ID. She was about to say what she needed to do to enroll in the basic training when Kong Wu interrupted her and said that there was no need for that. He had no intention of receiving the basic knowledge. The girl immediately fell silent, thinking that the guy must be upset because his level was so low. But if he doesn't get the training, he won't last even a minute in goal. The girl returned to work with the thought that it was better not to become a player if you got level F. Her stone, lying on the table, suddenly began to darken from snow white to gray, from gray to dark gray. The girl's gaze fell on the stone from which Kun Wu had just walked away. She couldn't understand what was happening to him. The most logical guess as to why the color began to change so quickly from pure white to almost black was that it must have broken. She thought that it couldn't be any other way since this person was an F rank. But when she reached out and touched the stone, it suddenly cracked and shattered. The woman just looked at the shards with hopelessness. He can't have such a black special ability. Even the last time Baek Kong Hong got S level, it was only dark gray. But here it is not dark gray, but real black. This has never happened before. She shouted loudly to replace the broken ball with a new one. A huge crowd gathered at the E-level gate near Seoul, looking for entertainment amid the chaos. Someone kept coming up to them and asking if they needed a robber on their team, but they always turned him down. Kong Wu, who had heard this conversation before, wondered for a moment what was wrong with the robbers. But apparently everyone had a certain order in which to recruit their troops. However, he immediately decided that he didn't care, since he was going to hunt alone and didn't care about the chatter around him. Kun Wu handed the employee the player ID he had just received. He looked at it, confirmed its level, and moved on. Entering the gate, passing through it, Kong Wu's first plan was to go into the forest and hunt monsters. After passing through the portal, he leaned over wearily and said, "Here it is." He was afraid that he would end up in hell again. but he still doesn't like this way of traveling because it causes unpleasant sensations. He stood up and straightened up to his full height, saying that he would probably look for monsters. A huge back grew behind him, and the man turned to face him. He turned towards the source of the sound, and he saw the shield that the youth was hiding behind, and apparently his squad on the youth's back. The youth was more than 2 meters tall, and his body consisted entirely of cubes. Kun Wu thought it was a bear. It was a coincidence. But no, it was definitely a man, but he looked like a predatory animal. He looked at the guy standing above him with a dark and distrustful look, silently wondering what he wanted. But when he asked if he was going to hunt alone, the guy honestly answered that he was. When he asked if he was increasing his rank, the guy answered that it was possible. People from his party approached the guy and said they were ready, and they gasped when he said no and continued talking to the guy. He was clearly the power in the party, and everyone immediately fell silent, and a shudder ran through each of their bodies. Meanwhile, he said that it seemed like the guy hadn't even finished his training yet, and if that was the case, it was better not to hunt alone. Ignoring the guy's mood, he told him that if he hadn't found a company yet, he should join in and go with them. His entire team was immediately outraged by his words, wondering why he was even making decisions for them, and in principle, he would not bring any benefit to the team. Then the big man turned to them and shouted that he was saving a man's life. They could save a man's life, but if they didn't care, they wouldn't get the magic stones at all. So let him go with them. Kong Wu thought that this big guy was actually a good person, but he still had to refuse, which he did, saying that he didn't want a party. However, the big man did not listen to him. He said that since consent had been obtained, he could introduce himself, took his hand and shook it, saying that his name was Kong Tai-su. Then, smiling amiably, he asked what the guy's name was. He calmly replied that his name was Kong Wu and thanked him for his kindness, and again tried to refuse to accompany him. But no such luck. He was interrupted by Kai's laughter. He said with a smile that Kong Wu could address him as you, since he was only 24 years old. The guy looked at him in shock. Of course, if you hear this from a big guy who looks like he's 30, you might think it's a lie. The guy shouted that he was simply born in the early 2000s and smiled, showing his ID. This has happened more than once. Kong Wu chuckled and shook his head, saying that in that case, fine. They would communicate on a first-name basis. Then he turned to the surprisingly silent guy named. With words of gratitude for what he had offered, but assured him that everything would be fine with him, he weighed and thought it over. Meanwhile, the guys from the party watched them in surprise. Tai-su became sad in response to the sharp answer and spat, but still, scratching the back of his head, replied that if he decided so, then nothing could be done. However, he warned him to be careful, especially he should be wary of the big brown goblins. If he saw them, he should run. The hobgoblin was the boss. These goblins are very different from others, both in appearance and size. Thinking once again that he was definitely a good guy, Kun Wu sincerely thanked him for his concern and advice. Tai-su and his group bid him farewell and retreated, hiding in the forest. The boy waved back, and he began to watch them hide in the forest, thinking that if he was really still green, he would go with them. After watching them go, he turned the other way, thinking that, despite all this, he was still working alone. Having said that it was time to set off, he moved with an even lighter gait into the depths of the forest. Having activated the movement, he quickly found himself in the place he needed. While walking through the forest, he noticed a wood goblin's trail, or rather tracks. There were a lot of them. They were definitely somewhere nearby, noticing the clearing they were walking through without noticing him. The guy was glad that he found them. Then, with a loud cry of, "Here they are!" he jumped straight into the clearing where this huge crowd stood. With a cry of bingo, he first killed one goblin with a black knife. He screamed, or rather, it turned out that there were 5 of them, and they all screamed at the same time. Kong Wu rushed at the goblins with the precision and agility of a wild beast. Dark energy flowed into Kong Buyu's left hand, and a black blade emerged from his left wrist. He immediately began to cut down the remaining goblins. He couldn't figure out if he really had hit the jackpot when he walked out into the clearing with those goblins. Judging by the sticks in their hands, they were hostile. But the guy didn't pay attention to this, pointing his blade towards the goblins. He finally suggested to start. The goblins rushed towards him in a crowd, shouting loudly. The goblins who came up faster than the others swung their homemade weapons at the calm guy. Before that, he had cut down 10 people at once, and now there were only 5 of them. He didn't even waste his strength in vain. With a few movements, he cut off their necks, and the creatures' heads fell from their shoulders. Kong Wu slashed and cut down the goblins that came too close to him. Although they tried their best to catch him and kill him, his speed made it seem like an impossible task. His soul was light. He quickly ran between the approaching goblins and cut them with his knife. There was nothing but stern concentration in his eyes. Kong Wu paid no attention to the corpses he left behind. The surviving goblins tried to oppose him and somehow resist him. However, they immediately found themselves cut in two, without even having time to do anything in response. Their fate did not stop the living goblins from doing the same, and that's how they were killed by the quick blows of this guy. He swung his knife around, cutting off the heads of everyone who got in his way, not really paying attention to how carefully he did it. He fought off attacks and killed anyone who came too close to him, and gradually his gaze became too mad. Even after everything that had happened, there were still too many goblins left, but now they were not eager to fight, but stood and trembled, looking at the guy with fear. Goblin blood was running down Kong Wu's knife and hand, but he paid no attention to it as he looked at the crowd in front of him. Seeing their number, Kong Wu happily said that in that case, since there were no fewer of them, he would finally be able to eat his fill. He then clenched his hand, holding the knife into a fist, preparing to attack the others. After a while, he hid the knife in his hand again, and with a heavy sigh, he wiped the sweat from his face, saying tiredly that he had finally killed them all. It had been quite difficult because of their numbers. The entire clearing in front of the guy, strewn with goblin corpses, was proof of this. Suddenly, Kong Wu was surprised to see a notification that he had successfully destroyed a level E monster. His level had risen to level 4, and his dark energy had increased by 1. Kong Wu opened the status window and looked at it again, noticing that he could pump up dark energy, increasing its level. He walked over and placed his hand on one of the corpses. As soon as he approached the bodies and touched them, the power of the devourer awakened. He said that he already knew that the magic stones did not contain dark energy. The black mist that rose from his body completely enveloped the goblins, and a terrifying sound of breaking bones and tearing flesh was heard. Kong Wu slowly closed his eyes to determine where the dark energy was coming from, and he definitely felt it. It didn't take long to search. He definitely felt the source. Its source was definitely not the magic stones. He felt it inside their bodies, or more precisely, the soul that resides in the body. Every body that was killed had a soul. The amount of dark energy depends on the time of death of the monster. This means that the faster the body is absorbed after death, the more dark energy can be obtained. The guy smiled at his thoughts. This was just great. If he continues in the same spirit, he will be able to sell stones and get dark energy. And all this could not fail to give him great pleasure. After draining all the energy from them, Kong Wu took 1 E-level stone and put it in his bag, saying that all that was left was to collect the crystals and move on. He collected crystals and wondered out loud how much chicken he could order if he sold all those stones. If you think about it, these bones now look like he ate the chicken and left only the bones. All his thoughts about food had now made him hungry, and he said that as soon as he got out of there, he would have to go out and eat somewhere. Thinking about this, he immediately remembered Han Sol and thought of her, realizing that he would have to take her with him. He was already imagining this picture, which made his mouth water. In order to somehow drive away the desire to eat, Kong Wu shook his head and loudly shouting that Han Sol should wait a little while he would take all kinds of chicken, quickly began to collect stones from the ground. Suddenly there was a loud, terrifying sound behind him. Kong Wu narrowed his eyes, and since the sounds were different from those made by the goblins, he turned towards the source of the noise. Then he turned completely in that direction. Between the trees stood a green, healthy goblin. Compared to normal goblins, which were about 1.5 meters tall, this one was huge, about 2 meters tall. Kong Wu recalled Tai Su's warning. He started approaching with a loud sound. Still looking at Kong Wu, the red-eyed goblin growled. In the clearing before him stood Kong Wu with a sack, surrounded by bones and broken weapons. The brownie, seeing that his shelter was destroyed, rushed at Kong Wu with a roar. Looking at him, the guy thought with fear that he was using real magic. In his hands, unlike the simple goblins with their curved swords, was a real dagger. The power of the hobgoblin dagger was supported by a small amount of magic. It was a surprise to Kong Wu that monsters could use magic. Kong Wu raised his hand and pulled out his blade to attack the hobgoblin. Because, in his opinion, when it comes to resolving power, his dark magic is superior to this magic. The goblin, meanwhile, swung his dagger at him with a loud roar and, without stopping screaming, he hit. Kunwu dodged the blow, causing a huge hole to form in the ground. The brownie screamed again and, overcome with anger, rushed at the guy. Kongwu raised his left hand and raised his blade to block the hobgoblin's attack, but with a sound like an explosion, he flew back. It was difficult to cover him from the front. The reason why he was thrown back was the elementary difference in the structure of their bodies, namely the presence of muscles. The goblin rushed after him, screaming again. Kongwu was intrigued by the battle. He was not surprised that he was thrown back. The battles in which he had the advantage could be counted on the fingers of one hand. The guy stopped right in front of the equally stopped goblin. In order to hold the sword that he swung at him, the boy had already extended 2 blades, holding the sword in the air with trembling hands. Kongwu was only annoyed that they were in different weight classes, because that was the main problem. He gritted his teeth, deciding what he needed to do. And he swung, hitting the huge monster with one of the knives and wounding it. The goblin growled even louder than before, and he got another hit on his shoulder guard. Noticing that the blow did not cause any harm to the goblin, Kongwu thought with annoyance that due to his characteristics, he would not be able to penetrate his defense. He jumped back in surprise, barely avoiding the monster's next attack. Jumping towards him, Kongwu thought that he would definitely find his weak spot. He then quickly jumped back from another blow, stopping to think about it. He dodged, avoiding the third blow. He jumped back from the rapidly approaching blow, and then he slipped under the blade again, dodging another blow. The goblin dropped to his knees in front of the boy, who was dodging again, and again hit the place from which it bounced. Slowing down, Kongwu thought about it. The goblin was using his size very well. This boss was definitely different from the goblins he had killed recently. The guy looked at him sternly, and he bounced back from another blow. He stopped away from the goblin, holding the stones in his hands. No matter how you look at it, his territory was destroyed, and his subordinates were killed. Running past the goblin, the guy looked into his eyes with a smile and said that this was his prey. The goblin turned towards him, but was distracted by something he threw behind him. It was one of the goblin heads from which he had sucked out all the dark energy. Realizing this, the goblin became enraged again. Looking at the naked hobgoblin, blinded by rage, Kongwu smiled, saying that this should be enough. He deftly dodged the monster's attack and then lunged forward himself. The power of rage, a power possessed by a demon named Kokol. Kokol used this power to enrage himself, thus giving himself even more power. Kunwu intended to use this power not on himself, but on the hobgoblin. Then the hobgoblin's movements will become even faster, and the power contained in the dagger will increase. When he touched it, the goblin screamed in fury. His strength had actually increased, and he charged at Kongwu using most of it. Kongwu smiled because he now knew what the hobgoblin would do and how he would act next. The goblin swung his sword again. Kunwu slipped underneath him again and avoided the blow. Then the goblin got angry and started to destroy the trees behind the guy, but he still couldn't get to him. He stared at the guy and swung again. Kongwu looked at the hobgoblin rushing towards him with an icy gaze, already struck by the power that made him go mad with anger. This ability allows you to strengthen the target several times, like a buff. But there was still one thing. In fact, when using this power, all thoughts are clouded by anger, and movements become chaotic and simple. So the goblin now struck from the left, and then from the right. Unable to catch the boy, he became more and more irritable, and his movements increasingly lost all common sense. The goblin let out a terrible roar and swung the dagger. Now that the hobgoblin had completely lost his mind, he was like an open book to Kongwu. In fact, it was a curse that made it very easy to lose one's mind. This would make it much easier for him to dodge, and Kongwu smiled and waved his hand to hit him. Kongwu arched his back to avoid the blow to the waist, and then plunged his knife into the hobgoblin's knee. He screamed as if he was beside himself and fell to the ground. The guy pulled out a black blade from his other hand. However, the goblin was not going to give up so easily and swung again to hit him. Kongwu was not going to give up until he realized that it was not he who had stabbed him. He quickly slit his throat with a black blade. The goblin with his throat cut made a few more attacks, but eventually he stopped moving. Clicking his tongue, Kongwu looked at the monster's body, not forgetting to say that it was simply a complete disappointment. If it had happened earlier, he would have dealt with them in no time. Now he needed to pump up again. At that moment, a familiar sound of a bell rang over his ear, and a window appeared before his eyes. After clicking on it, information was displayed that he had single-handedly destroyed the goblin hideout. The bonus points were 150%, The sea-level boss was successfully destroyed. Also, upon reaching level 11 and rising to rank 2, a second advantage became available to him. The second function was unlocked. This made the boy rejoice and exclaim joyfully, clenching his hand into a fist. A number of window messages appeared before his eyes, and Kong Wu looked at them with interest. They described a rank 2 special ability. Rank 2 special ability. Irresistible hunger. Result: obtaining more dark energy when using the power of absorption. Kong Wu beamed and smiled. It's not because he has now obtained a high-class power. It doesn't matter whether it's low level, high level, or high class. The important thing is that the ability he has obtained will help him accumulate dark energy many times faster. According to him, in this case, he needs to check the effectiveness of the new government. He placed his hand on the hobgoblin's body, activating the ability to devour. A black mist instantly burst out from his hand and enveloped his body. The guy noticed that the smoke became thicker, but whether it was related to the new ability or not, he did not know. At the moment when Kong Wu had sucked out almost all of his energy, a window appeared in front of his eyes, which said that the emergence of an overwhelming feeling of hunger would consume more dark energy. The guy noticed that the characteristic had increased by a certain percentage and concluded that from now on, he would have to catch monsters of a higher level, since this is not an absolute value, but is measured in percentages. He decided that in this case it might be worth a try. Kong Wu closed his eyes slightly, trying to feel how the new dark magic felt inside him. His face suddenly frowned. He thought that if there were more troops, then the strength should have increased. In the best case, it could even double. However, it seems that it has increased by as much as 3 times. But how could this happen? It was impossible to mindlessly rejoice at the sudden increase in strength. It could be very dangerous. Kun Wu returned to his seat and concentrated on his thoughts. It took less than a couple of minutes for him to understand the reason for the sudden power surge. The power that sealed Manhwa is weakening. However, he still couldn't understand why this was happening. He thought about it even when he opened his eyes. Kong Wu opened the main status window to see if anything else had changed other than the rank increase. He wondered if with each increase the power that sealed Manhwa would weaken. The guy smiled slyly. Kun Wu's gaze took on a new, crazy color. If that was really the case, then he would only need to reach a certain level, and his strength would return in full. He stood up from the ground, thinking that he would need to visit a higher-level gate. Kun Wu picked up the magic stone that was lying on the ground, and with a crazy smile, he said that his goal to prove the theory was to reach level 20 and get rank 3. After a while, Kong Wu and Hano were already sitting in the diner, gradually devouring the chicken on the plate. Kun Wu quickly ate the chicken with his gloved hands, having completely gnawed and put aside the bone. He reached for the beer, and then he drank half a liter of beer in one gulp, and his body began to tremble. He said it was very tasty and nodded his head in agreement that the taste was indeed delicious. Han Sol asked if it was really that delicious. The guy nodded with a smile and said that it was simply excellent. Han Sol narrowed her eyes at Kong Wu, who was wolfing down the chicken with a vengeance, and continued to ask in a slightly offended voice what he thought could be better than her kimchi jjigae. The boy closed his eyes and thought. His behavior was uncertain. Chicken and kimchi jjigae. You can't choose just one. After much hesitation, Kong Wu said that between the two, her kimchi jjigae was better. Chicken may be delicious, but it couldn't compare to his passion for kimchi jjigae. Han Seo laughed and said it was just a joke. He laughed back without answering. The girl, using tongs, transferred her chicken to his plate, offering it to him to eat. The guy replied that it was the most valuable but accepted the treat. Satisfied with Han Sol's answer, his cheeks instantly turned red. She smiled secretly, and then turned to Kong Wu and asked if he had any friends or family. Hearing this question, Kun Wu froze for a moment, and then silently took a sip of beer. He slammed his cup down on the table, knocking the fork off it at the same time. He replied that he had no friends, no family, no home. Meanwhile, the fork fell to the floor and began to swing. Finally noticing it, the boy bent down to pick up his fork. Han Sol asked him where he was going to spend the night if he had no friends, no home, not even a family. Kun Wu picked up his fork from the floor and replied laconically that he would spend the night somewhere. Ignoring the girl's gloomy face, he said that he didn't know how or what would happen, but he thought he would be okay. After listening to him, she got his attention by calling him by name and asked if he would mind staying at their house. The guy was stunned by her offer and asked in surprise if they really didn't mind him staying with them. Han Sol, taking out a new fork, replied that they didn't mind. She then handed him the gift, telling him that he had no idea how much he had helped them, so he shouldn't worry about it. Kunwu said that in that case, they should be thanked for their help, and he took the fork from her hand, saying that he relied on her. The girl reciprocated his feelings. She found it difficult to hide her interest in Kong-woo. She thought that perhaps he had quite a lot on his mind. The guy, meanwhile, seemed to remember something, nodded, and, taking out an envelope from his bosom, placed it on the table in front of Han Seol, saying that he wanted to give it to her. There was about 3 million won inside. The girl looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he showed it to her and gave it to her. Seeing her hesitation, Kong-woo suggested that she consider it as payment for rent. The girl replied that even then she could not accept it. She explained that she could not do this because he had already helped them so much. She can't take the money either. Han Sol owes him her life and can't accept money from him under the pretext of paying for accommodation. The guy said that they had already spent a lot on him, and he realized that they were living modestly. So let him not think about anything and just take the money. Plus, he eats delicious food every day. Let him consider this, if not as payment for housing, then at least money for food. He pushed the envelope towards Han Sol and left it there. She immediately thanked him and took the envelope. It seemed that the moment she accepted the envelope, she was about to cry, and she continuously thanked the guy who only rejected her thanks. She was worried that this month would be very difficult, so the envelope Kong-woo offered could be compared to long-awaited rain during a drought. Then Han Seol promised with a gentle smile that after buying the meat, she would make an even more filling kimchi jjigae tomorrow. It would be even more delicious. Kong-woo's eyes lit up at the mention of kimchi jjigae. These were not just words. These were words that stirred the mind. As expected, Han Sol is just an angel. Delicious kimchi every day. Kong-woo's consciousness drew a colorful flower garden, and among the flowers, Han Sol with snow-white wings and a clear smile. Flowers bloom here and there next to her, and in her hands is kimchi jjigae. Suddenly remembering something, the guy asked if there was a level D gate in this area. The girl, remembering their location, replied that there was only one, but there were lizard people there. Kunwu thought that he should try to go tomorrow. He needs monsters that will level up faster and preferably as strong as possible. Not only that, it would also increase his income. He also wondered what lizard meat tasted like. The girl took him to one of the rooms, explaining that her brother had already used it. But now, for obvious reasons, it was him. Kong-woo thanked her, and said that it was only thanks to her that he could finally sleep peacefully. She replied that she had done nothing of the sort, and wishing him good night, she turned off the light. Kong-woo wished her good night in return, and with a smile, he waited until she closed the door and the room was plunged into darkness. He stretched and finally fell back onto the soft bed. After 10,000 years, he was finally able to lie down on something soft. It's so quiet and cozy there. He fell asleep thinking about how great it was to be back. There were many times more people in front of the D-level gate than in front of the E-level gate. This was because after completing the initial training, players would immediately receive a D-level certificate. But of course, for those who had just reached the second rank, hunting at the D-tier gate was not an easy task, because they had no combat skills. That was why the D-tier gate was full of those selling uniforms to newcomers. Somewhere there, a guy was shouting at the top of his lungs, advertising himself to get into the group. Kong-woo looked at him with sympathy and walked in the opposite direction. He had no intentions towards this guy, and he certainly had no intention of inviting him along, so he quickly handed over control and entered the gate, passing through it straightway. The scenery in this gate was different from that in the E-level gate. Kunwu immediately warmed up and stretched. Then they decided that it would be best to move without making unnecessary noise. He activated the power of silence, a skill that can turn off necessary sounds. He did this on the recommendation of Han Sol, turned off the sound of his footsteps, and went in search of monsters. Then he gradually began to move further and further away from the portal, remembering everything that Han Sol had told him. She said that they have poor eyesight and are very sensitive to sounds. Based on their body structure, they can be classified as reptiles. If you trip, a horde of lizards will immediately come running from all around. Kong-woo noticed several lizardmen standing not far from him. There were 3 of them at once. Han Sol said that they are also afraid of fire. They say that the fire mage squads are best at hunting the lizardmen. The boy approached quietly, activating the power of hellfire, a power that belonged to a demon named Andras. Kong Wu pointed his hand at the lizard people. The lizard man screamed loudly in pain and surprise. The small flames spread to the monsters, and once it reached its target, it became so large that it covered the entire body of the lizard men, burning them one by one. He continued to watch the hellfire doing its work. However, it cannot be extinguished by normal methods. It can be repelled with dark energy or magic, but there is no other way, since the flames burn life energy, not the body. After a while, they fell to the ground screaming, having lost all their life force. They had literally just been burning in hellfire, but there was not a single burn on their bodies. A killed monster can always be eaten by consuming it. Suddenly, the thought of Tahan flashed through Kong Wu's mind. He also belonged to the Andras Guild. He had heard this somewhere by chance, a guild that was quite significant among mid-level guilds. The guild that had so many bad rumors suddenly matched the name of the power that Kong Wu was currently using. But in any case, if he interferes with him or angers him, he will simply kill him. Kun Wu unleashed his power of devouring onto the bodies that had been stripped of their life force, holding them in his hands. As Kong Wu was doing this, a strange sound came from behind him. He turned around. There, among the trees, stood a huge number of monsters looking at him with anger. One of them looked him straight in the eye, continuing to growl. The guy just smiled back at him. Kong Wu used the power of hellfire to deal with 3 or 4 lizard men at a time, so he specifically wanted to look out for monsters that gathered in groups. At the same time, they roared loudly, unable to resist him. The boy thought that they were too noisy and difficult to handle when there were many of them. Because of this, he decided to activate the power of silence. In fact, he didn't even have to hunt. It was so simple that Kun Wu doubted whether he was hunting at all. He used the same technique, and the result was the same. A notification appeared that his level had been increased by 1. Everything turned out as he thought. The higher the level, the more effort and time it takes to increase it. Standing in the swamp looking for monsters, Kong Wu thought that this was still not enough. He was wondering if he should organize another raid when someone called out to him. The guy turned towards the voice. The man said that judging by his equipment, he was a newbie, and asked if he would like to join their guild and hunt with them. Kun Wu reluctantly asked what kind of guild it was. Behind him stood a guy covered in acne and 4 other members of the group. He smiled and said that he was talking about the Andras Guild. A silver necklace sparkled around his neck, confirming his membership in this group. The guy looked at them indifferently for a while, and then he turned the other way and said he wasn't interested. The guy who invited him to join looked after him in silence for a long time, and then, in a rude manner, he shouted that Kong Wu was an arrogant bastard who was still green and could not handle them alone. The girl standing next to him asked what they should do, and suggested what would happen if the master found out that they had just let him go. He replied that if that were the case, he would have simply been taken away half dead. In a more somber tone, he continued that they would finally be able to relieve stress, and will teach him a very good life lesson. Kong Wu still hunted monsters in the wilderness and swamps, burning any he found. They burned with a loud cry, and then fell to the ground exhausted. The guy watching them slowly used the power of devouring to suck out their life force. He exhaled and thought that it seemed like he had already killed all the monsters in the area and there were no more left. It's good to be safe, but he thinks it would be better if it were hotter so he could level up faster. The boy stood there in confusion, wondering what to do. While Kong Wu was hesitating, a voice came from behind him. He turned around. He already knew that voice. It was that same pimply guy who, just in case, reminded him that he was an older comrade. He then said that they just came to see how he was doing and how he was hunting. Each of them looked at Kong Wu with a grin. Kong Wu smiled imperceptibly at such a brazen lie. Apparently, they enjoyed trampling people into the dirt. The corners of Kong Wu's lips twitched, and he said in a calm tone that, as they saw, the hunt was going well. Hojun leaned over to Kong Wu and looked around him more closely. He then said that even if that was the case, he did not see any traces of corpses on his clothes. The phrase about a successful hunt did not fit with the lack of lizard men bodies. Kun Wu shrugged and calmly replied that he was taking a break. The guy responded with a drawn-out, "Oh," and then asked if he had spoken rudely to his elders. Kun Wu replied that he was furious that they were poking their noses into his affairs. Hojun, looking at the calm Kong Wu, changed his expression and said harsh words. Kun Wu mockingly asked what it was, and if they wanted to fight. Before this, the group members who were standing quietly changed their expressions and grabbed their weapons. Hojun extended his hand to his armed comrade and ordered them to stop. The guy who pulled out the gun wanted to object, but he was told not to worry. "Don't worry, we'll still re-educate this rude guy," Hojun said mockingly. He didn't understand how this scoundrel could even bluff when his abilities were only B rank at most. But there was no need to get his hands dirty during re-education. There was a better way to do what every newbie was afraid of. The guy ominously said that Kong Wu would regret his overconfidence. Kun Wu mockingly replied that he couldn't wait for that moment. Hojun, looking at the fearless Kong Wu, pulled out his dagger. He smiled contentedly and extended his hand with a metal bracelet on his wrist, saying that he would see how far Kong Wu would go by hitting him with this weapon. His group members knew what Hojun was up to and watched with anticipation as the boy asked if he knew that the lizardmen were sensitive to sound. Kong Wu didn't answer, but Kong Wu knew this information from the very beginning of the hunt. Kong Wu guessed what Hojun would do and smirked. A dagger, a metal bracelet, and sound-sensitive lizardmen. If you combine all these facts, there was only one option left. He ran the dagger across his wrist. The pure and melodic sound of metal echoed throughout the swamp. Wild cries could be heard coming from the herd of lizardmen heading towards them. Hojun ordered his teammates to prepare defensive magic, and then he laughed heartily, asking if Kong Wu was scared. "After all, judging from the sound, there are more than 10 lizardmen rushing towards us. Don't you think this is too much for a lesson?" Hojun chuckled. Kong Wu remained silent, and Hojun continued to say that if Kong Wu asked politely, he would be helped before he became a cripple. He asked if Kong Wu was silent only because he was afraid. Hearing this, Kong Wu raised the corners of his lips, and then smiled at Hojun's ridiculous action. He mockingly said that he thought Hojun would do something more, but apparently that was all he was capable of. Kun Wu looked at Hojun's confused expression and concentrated his strength in both his hands, with the words that if Hojun is going to do something, he must do it right. Kong Wu activated his sonic power and clapped his hands loudly. This power allowed him to make every movement so loud that he wanted to go deaf so he couldn't hear the sounds. Hojun and his comrades turned pale. Making noise in the lizardmen's lair was pure suicide. Kun Wu continued to use the power of sound. It seemed like bombs were exploding here and there. Hojun's screams for him to stop were mixed with the sounds emitted by Kong Yu's power. Although Hojun acted like a madman, he was not truly mad. Kong Wu took the last step and fell silent. Kun Wu slowly looked at their expressions and smiled mockingly, enjoying their position. The pimply guy shouted again that Kun Wu was just crazy, but the rest of his squad didn't say a word. Their faces turned pale and their thoughts became confused, going over all the possible ways out of the situation. Suddenly, eerie sounds were heard from all sides. The number of lizardmen rushing towards them seemed to be approaching 100. They were surrounded by lizardmen on all sides. It was simply impossible to escape. The girl said in fear that she had never seen so many lizard people, and the guy told her to come to her senses and said that everything would be fine and that she needed to focus on the shield. Hojun readied his dagger and shouted angrily at Kong Wu, asking if he was going to take them all to his grave with him. Kun Wu used the power of silence and took a few light steps. Despite the sticky, swampy terrain, his steps were absolutely silent. The boy climbed a tree and mockingly asked if Hojun had said that the lizard people were sensitive to sounds. He said he already knew about it. Suddenly, the loud sounds made by the monsters became even louder and they rushed towards the dome. Hojun, who was watching this along with the others, knew that there was absolutely no way for a second-rank player to survive being attacked by so many lizardmen. He shouted out Kun Wuyu's words again, calling him his son, __, and asking if he had gone mad, deciding to finally die. Kong Wu, leaning against a nearby tree, watched Hojun's actions with a satisfied expression. He asked what Hojun was talking about and replied that he didn't even think about death. As soon as they died, he activated the power of silence again and continued to watch them with a smile. The monsters even climbed out of the trees. They were everywhere and constantly fell on this particular dome. Hojun saw this and trembled. Hojun thought that Kong Wu had the power to completely control sounds after all. Before he made unrealistically loud sounds, and now he muffled his steps. It is not difficult to conclude. Even the slightest hope has disappeared. Now hopelessness could be read on Hojun's face, but he was distracted by a crowd of monsters approaching from all sides. And that wasn't even the main thing. A second later, he turned around and screamed at the top of his lungs, asking where the shield had gone. See the girl holding it being pierced by a spear. She barely realized what had happened, so now she looked straight at him, living out the last minutes of her life. Seeing this, Hojun fell to the ground in fear and helplessness. Then he covered his mouth with both hands, trying not to scream. Turning his head, he saw the corpse of one of his friends in front of him, which a huge monster was chewing with gusto. This picture frightened him even more. He took his last breath, opened his hand, and released the spear. What he saw made Hojun close his eyes and mouth so tightly that he held his breath and did not breathe at all. After a while, Hojun sighed mournfully, wiping the lizardman's blood from his face. Hojun was horrified as he looked towards Kunwu and began to ask for help and salvation. He begged him because if they didn't get at least a little help, the situation wouldn't change. The guy began to pronounce words syllable by syllable, and showing his fist, wished Hojun good luck, not forgetting to smile sweetly. Hojun screamed heartbreakingly that Kongwu was a beast. He didn't care, he had nothing to lose. At that moment, one of the monster's spears pierced Hojun's heart, who stood there in confusion. The boy watched as the monsters devoured him. Now he had no thoughts of helping them. He was definitely not a good person. More precisely, he survived because he stopped being good in a world where the main rule was anger for anger, murder for murder. He responds to evil only with greater evil and the intent to kill. Bloody carnage. Thinking about this, Kunwu smiled madly. Several lizardmen fell to the ground, engulfed in hellfire. Tired of fighting Hojun's troop, they had no strength to resist Kongwu, so the monsters died one after another. All Kongwu could do was keep the fire going. He exhaled and took the fire out of his hands, looking around the place where it had been, the swamp covered with corpses. Even strong people would puke at the sight of such a scene, but the guy didn't pay attention to it. Thinking that he could continue, he stretched out his hand, activating the power of devouring. A black haze enveloped the dead bodies of the lizardmen. A notification appeared stating that the level of dark magic has increased by 1. At that moment, another notification popped up saying that he couldn't use the Devourer's power on objects protected by the system. Kongwu remembered that he had seen something like this somewhere before, and it was similar to that time. He noticed Hojun's body with a spear through his heart among the pile of lizard men bodies. He thought it was probably because of these guys since the players were protected by the system. It was a shame to hear that, because he was wondering if it was possible to extract stats from a player. Kongwu looked at Hojun's body without any regret. He thought that since a demon's power could be taken away, there was a high probability that it could be taken away from a player. But that wasn't that important. He exhaled and smiled at his thoughts. Dark energy was still more important to him. He walked around all the bodies except for the members of Hojun's group. A notification appeared that his dark energy had reached 30. Kongwu took a deep breath and felt the dark energy spread throughout his entire body. Compared to last time, the dark energy was much more. Not only its quantity has increased, but also its quality. If you compare the hellfire he used a couple of hours ago with the fire that is burning now, the difference is obvious. The flames have become stronger and larger. This meant that the quality of dark energy also increased. Now all he had to do was raise his level. Kongwu, who had collected the magic stones lying on the ground, nodded his head in satisfaction. Now that he had hunted a bit for the 3rd rank, he would obtain it and find out whether the power that sealed Manhwa really weakened as the rank increased. The guy calmly walked past Hojun's cold body, deciding for himself that he needed to bulk up a little more. 3 days have passed since then. Kunwu sat at the table and ate food straight from the frying pan with gusto. After finishing eating, he praised the food with a smile, saying that it was very tasty. The girl thanked him for such a good assessment of her dish and asked if he was going hunting today. Wiping his face, the guy replied that he was getting ready and thought he would most likely return in the evening. The girl took the teapot and asked if he had overdone it, since he hadn't rested at all. Kunwu calmly replied that everything was fine, and he asked when her training would end. Han Sol replied that in a few days. They were told that they would now go to the goblins to level up. She doesn't know if she can get a good stat, but she still wants to reach rank 2 as soon as possible. Kunwu told her with a smile that she could do it. The girl thanked him and handed him a cup, asking him to drink some tea before leaving. He hadn't rested for a long time, so she thought he was very tired during this time. Kunwu thanked her, thinking to himself that she was a real angel. The girl remembered something and told him what she thought about the gate, and asked if he had heard anything yet. The guy asked in surprise what he had heard. She replied that there had been a lot of rumors about a team of assassins lately. Maybe they were just rumors, but he still had to be careful. A team killer is someone who fakes their level and attacks other players. Perhaps these rumors are spread by the Andres Guild. But he doubts it because he had no witnesses, and he is sure of it. Looking at their bodies, one could tell that they were killed by the lizardmen. If he was the one who killed the team, then he had nothing to worry about. But he may not know that either. Therefore, in order to be prepared for the unknown, he needs to level up as soon as possible. Notifications poured in that he had reached level 20, that he could be promoted to rank 3, and that a third function had been unlocked for him. The guy looked at them in surprise. Last time his magical power had increased, but this time everything was different. Kong Wu stretched out his hand and, using Andres's power, ignited the hellfire. A large flame gradually slid down from Kong Wu's palm. It was a real flame of hell, thirsty for life force, and he said that he knew it. Kong Wu looked at the 2-meter-tall fire with a satisfied smile, thinking that more and more dark energy was leaking out through the weakened seal. He looked at the ground and thought that perhaps it was worth trying the magic stones that lay in the bodies of monsters, which, however, never ceased to sparkle. He looked at the third feature, a demon thirsty for magical power. Its action allowed it to transform magical stones into dark energy and absorb it. He looked down and thought that perhaps it was worth trying the magic stones that lay in the bodies of the monsters, which, however, never stopped sparkling. Kun Wu's eyes, who had mastered the new method of accumulating dark magic, shone. To his surprise, a single stone contained as much dark energy as the monsters' bodies. The amount of dark magic he could extract from a single monster increased, or to be more precise, it doubled. Compared to the overwhelming hunger, the power he had obtained when he was promoted to rank 2, the ability he had obtained now was more useful. But back then, if he wanted to use it, he would have to give up selling the stones. But over the last few days, he had already earned enough money, and for some time he did not have to go to the exchange office at all. Since he finished the hunt earlier than expected, he had a lot of free time. Plus, he wanted to try out his new abilities. So he decided it was time to stretch a little. Kun Wu sighed sadly, and he smoothly descended to the ground. He looked ahead calmly. And then Kun Wu used the power of heaven and soared upward. Thanks to the fact that he had been promoted to the 3rd rank and could use more dark magic, the power of the heavens did not become too much of a problem for him. He stopped on the branch of a tall tree and sat down a little to calm down. But no matter how hard he tried, nothing could be seen because of the intertwined tree branches. And the lizardman boss, too. Kong Wu had hoped to find the boss from the air, but it was harder than he expected. He clicked his tongue in disappointment. He wanted to absorb a higher-level magic stone. He thought bitterly that everything would be easier if he could use the power of the observer. At this moment, Kong Wu heard a familiar voice resounding in the pure sound of metal. It was the voice of Tai Su, who had just gathered a troop in front of the gate. His voice was full of anger, and he spoke faster than usual. Kong Wu saw 2 guys surrounding Tai Su who said that not only did he look strong, but his face matched the rest of him. They didn't think he would be so persistent. Kun Wu didn't quite understand what was going on there, but it was definitely not normal. Next to Tai Su lay the bleeding scoundrel they had spoken to at the gate. Meanwhile, Tai Su shouted loudly, asking the boys why they were attacking members of their own group. They asked him angrily why he was making so much noise and told him to be quiet, because soon all the lizard people would come running to them. Tai Su shouted at them, demanding an answer to the question, holding up a shield in front of him. Listening to Tai Su's dialogue with his comrades, Kong Wu narrowed his eyes. Even after hearing only a fragment of the conversation, it was not difficult to understand what was happening. They were betrayed. These 2 were in Tai Su's group, and then suddenly attacked their teammates. According to rumors, they were the team's assassins. Apparently, they snuck into the gate disguised as members of the group, but their goal was not to kill monsters, but to kill their teammates to take their valuables and uniforms. One of the guys yelled at Tai Su to shut up and stand still, and then attacked him. Tai Su immediately blocked his attack with his shield. However, due to the force of the impact, he still flew back several meters and slowed down. Gritting his teeth, he continued to look at the boys. One of the guys noticed that Tai Su was indeed invulnerable, and the other asked why he was holding up so well if he was only rank 2. Tai Su, without letting go of the shield, gripped the handle tighter. Proclaiming loudly that his soul, unlike theirs, was not corrupted, he thrust the shield into the ground with force. Gritting his teeth, he focused all his strength on his shield hand, and the shield glowed with a yellowish tint. The guy finished speaking by saying that he was no longer going to tolerate this. The guys started approaching him, saying that maybe he had activated some powerful ability, but if he hadn't reached rank 3, he wouldn't be able to defeat them.